Welcome to the Intuitive Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Rafferty, a shamanic healer trained in Western medicine and acupuncture, and I'm here to bring you on a journey of holistic healing that explores the science of the physical body, combined with mental and emotional well-being, energetic and spiritual health. And I am so excited to have you guys here today, because I really want to talk about something that I have wanted to record a pod on for so long. It has been on my list forever. And it's something that I see in my own life every day. And it's also something I see in all of my sessions when we're dealing with the energetics of relational dynamics. And that is something called the drama triangle. And I just want to explore this today to give you guys a bit of an insight into the roles that we assume in relationship to others, especially during conflict. And oftentimes this involves unconscious kind of programming or subconscious dynamics in which we get drawn into a role because we feel comfortable in that role, even though it doesn't necessarily serve us or the other person well. So the drama triangle essentially is a model of three unconscious roles that people can cycle through when we enter into a conflict space. And what are these three roles? Essentially, they're the victim, the rescuer, and the persecutor. And I'm going to go through each of these today, talk a little bit about the behavioral presentations of each of these roles, how it shows up in your world, so that you can begin to recognize when you're in one of these roles. Because, you know, at the end of the day, becoming aware of our behaviors is the first step to actually being able to heal and move beyond those behavioral patterns that keep us trapped in ways of being that aren't necessarily for our greatest good. But I'm going to speak into a little bit about the origins of the wounds that lead us to play out these roles. And I want to speak about the energetics and how we can potentially heal our relationship to being in this dynamic with people. So let's get stuck in. So the energy of the drama triangle. What is the drama triangle? Essentially, it was created by Stephen Cartman, and he was a psychiatrist that came up with this concept in 1968. He published essentially a publication that was called Fairy Tales and Script Drama Analysis. And I absolutely love the fact that it's called fairy tales, first of all, because, you know, I love speaking to fairies and spirits. But Cartman actually built this model around observing actual fairy tales, which is so interesting. So he'd sit down and watch these fairy tales essentially, and basically he started to identify the victim that needed rescuing, the rescuer who would swoop in and save the day, and the persecutor who was the villain in the whole situation. And the thing is, this is so translatable to our day-to-day dynamic. So it's definitely worth getting comfy as we explore the different roles, you know. So essentially, as a psychiatrist, he gave us these psychotherapeutic or psychological principles, which I always love kind of exploring myself. I feel that they're kind of heady in some senses. They pull us up into our mind. They kind of bring us into a space where we begin exploring and thinking about our behaviors and getting curious about them. Essentially, they give us a map, a roadmap that we can begin to explore. However, one thing I love about the shamanic work, the deeper energetic work, that's getting into the energetic roots and clearing these kind of imprints that lead us to unconsciously play out these behaviors in the first place. So I really tend to kind of look at the differences in kind of psychology or the kind of more thought out processes with a lot of this versus the energetic, the emotional and the somatic or body based healing. I feel like the energetic aspect is the medicine that helps us to move through a lot of these things. And it's so important to come out of our head a lot of the time with this and into the body to feel the energy and the emotion of the experience in so many ways. And that's why I kind of wanted to weave these things together throughout this pod today. Now, as I kind of journey through the three roles, I'd love for you to think of a recent conflict that you've had in your own world. and start to think of it in terms of how I describe the behavioural presentation or patterns of each of these three roles that I'm going to explore, and maybe begin to notice which role you fill. Which role do you slip into? And, sometimes, and well, it's not sometimes, it's most of the time, it's actually without choosing. It's actually just a pattern in which we show up in a certain way. So I'd love for you to actually kind of think about this as you're navigating through this podcast episode today. So let's do a bit of a deep dive into each of the three main roles. And like I say, I'm going to kind of talk a little bit about the behavioral presentations, about the trauma-informed origins of some of these things, and also kind of the shamanic and energetic layers, which is absolutely my favorite. So let's get stuck in, first of all, with the victim. Now, this is a very challenging one because, nobody likes to ever say that they are a victim, and in certain conflict dynamics, even the word can conjure up a certain feeling within us. And when I started doing psychotherapy myself and really starting getting into the nitty gritty of my own victim mentality, it was transformative, but it was deeply uncomfortable territory to actually recognize that I went into victim mentality in certain relational dynamics with people. Now, I really, really want to highlight that this kind of victim role that I'm talking about, it needs to be distinguished from actual true harm that can be caused by people, and in this kind of model of the drama triangle, the victim role typically kind of refers more so to a chronic stance that we take in relationship to others. It actually doesn't refer to someone that is validly naming real harm that has been done to them. And I really want to kind of emphasize that before we move forward. However, in this kind of concept with regard to the framing within the drama triangle, how does the victim present? So often we tend to feel powerless. A lot of the time we're waiting to be rescued by other people. And oh my God, that was such a killer for me to kind of to realize that I was waiting for someone to swoop in and rescue me in certain circumstances, rather than standing in my power and recognizing you have got this. You are much stronger than you actually think that you are, But also, a victim mentality is difficulty taking responsibility for your actions or responsibility in general. And I find this absolutely intriguing. And so many of my clients come through and we end up exploring relational dynamics in which partners are failing to take responsibility for their actions, or perhaps actually failing to just take responsibility in general for their lives and for their journey in this world. So, it's really, really important to kind of identify when we ourselves are slipping into that pattern of behavior. And sometimes we can actually really clearly see when someone that we're in a relational dynamic with is acting as a victim within the circumstance. Now, from a trauma-informed perspective, I tend to find that when I'm actually sitting with clients, we really go into the nitty-gritty when they have identified themselves that they're acting within a victim mentality. And what does it often link to? It's usually linked to things like inconsistency or unpredictability with a caregiver when you were growing up. And, that's really such a challenging space for a little child to find themselves in, because they never really know whether their needs are actually going to be met. And, sometimes we're left in those circumstances feeling very, very helpless. And, I think in those circumstances, we would rather feel safe than actually use our own agency to step into a space of responsibility, because sometimes as a child in those circumstances, if we try and repeatedly fail because we are being told that we're failing, and it is deeply, deeply painful. So, it's easier not to try at all in those moments. It is easier to just, become complacent and do what you're told, essentially. So I tend to find that that victim mentality arises from this relational dynamic in early childhood in relation to one or both caregivers on this journey in life. Now, from an energetic or shamanic perspective, how does this tend to show up? So I tend to find that it's often linked to chronic disempowerment. So, maybe you've grown up in a familial dynamic, or maybe there's been a pattern within the family lineage in which people disempower each other. And that comes from a deep place of fear and projection. And I'm going to get into a lot of this stuff when we talk about the persecutor. But usually we've been disempowered, and we end up in this space where, we constantly are looking to seek permission for moving forward with anything. And we become so comfortable in these roles. And keeping in mind, this is all unconscious wounding, And in these circumstances, when you begin to really realize and really accept that potentially you're stepping into a victim mentality, begin to look at the patterns around you. What did your primary caregivers do? Potentially there's a victim within the caregiver unit. And, we've inherited that pattern of behavior. This is generally very inherited. It's very ancestral in the wounding, and it typically tends to go several generations back. So really start to get into the nitty gritty of questioning where this type of behavior may have arisen from, And as someone who's a recovering victim, I have to tell you, the role is oddly comfortable. Like, it's strangely comfortable. And we tend to surround ourselves with rescuers in some senses, and they'll step in and rescue us. And it's so nice to be rescued, especially when we were younger, when we weren't rescued and that wasn't the behavior. It's lovely for that to be the case later on in life, And even if you find it oddly comfortable in many ways, and oddly familiar in other ways, it can also be very painful, and that's because we know deep down that something isn't energetically aligned for us, that we're not standing in our sovereign energy, we're not living out our potential. And, we know that we can step into more energetically responsible roles. However, we keep getting pulled back into this space. Now, that's the victim. I want to speak now about the rescuer. Again, another deeply familiar role to me. So I hope you're beginning to pick up here that we can assume multiple roles depending on our relational dynamics with different individuals. And I'll get into that after I've gone through each of the roles. So, what is the behavioral patterns that we tend to see in the rescuers? They are the overgivers. They're the fixers. They are the ones that struggle with boundaries. And a lot of the time, we tend to derive a sense of identity, a sense of value, a sense of worth from being needed. Does that sound familiar? And one thing is, if you are a rescuer, from the outside, you look so generous. It's so lovely to be the one that steps in to help, giving all the time. And, subconsciously, we feel needed, we feel wanted, and it's lovely that people perceive us to be nice and to be kind, But this is exactly why this role keeps us trapped in a lot of ways, because, a lot of the time we think we're doing things from the goodness of our heart, but actually it's generally because we are being perceived in those ways from an external source. So it's external validation for showing up as the overgiver. But we typically tend to have boundary issues. And this is really, really important. And this is also really why it's very hard for us to recognize this role within ourselves, because we like to feel like we're kind and we're giving, And generally speaking, this role is most often mistaken for something that's perceived as being very virtuous, And it's something that I think we have to get really, really familiar with and uncomfortable with in order to be able to change these passioning behaviors within us. And this is really, really tricky because, it's nice to feel like we're giving. And, I think there's definitely a difference between being perceived as being nice and being kind, and doing what doesn't deplete you at the end of the day. So get really honest with yourselves on this journey. Are you that rescuer archetype who keeps stepping in to help people out of their crappy situations? Because it could be something much deeper that's driving this behavior. Now, from a trauma-informed perspective, this type of behavior is often linked to parentification. So, when you were younger, were you given adult responsibilities too early? Did you become emotionally responsible for one of your caregivers' emotional well-being? And, was your worth actually tied to you being useful? Emotionally useful? Were you useful around the house? How did you show up in your younger years in relation to your caregivers? So something really, really interesting within that with regard to your value, your worth, and how you were perceived for being placed in some of these roles. Now, from an energetic or shamanic perspective, I see this as a massive energy leak. It is literally like your aura, your chakras, everything is just hemorrhaging energy, And when you step in to help others at the expense of yourself, this is the main thing to take into account. That is when you compromise your own energy field. You hemorrhage your own energy in order to show up in a certain role. The rescuer's energy field is often very permeable. I see it like it's being punctured lots of times and there's just energy leaking left, right and center. And someone who has a leaky energy field, we have to keep in mind that yes, you can lose energy very easily. People can just reach right into your energy field and take what they need. And, so we lose energy. But also energetic exchange happens both ways. You can take on other people's energy. So you take on other people's distress as your responsibility. Are you responsible for fixing their stuff? Do you take on that responsibility? That's overly responsible behavior. And that's energetically draining, regardless of how good an intention it is behind that. We have to recognize when we're leaking energy in these circumstances. The majority of people that I see that come in with this type of wound, they are laden down. I almost see it like phyllo pastry within the energy field. Layers and layers and layers of energy that is not theirs. And sometimes that weighs heavy within certain chakra points. But I almost see it like phyllo pastry weighing deeply on the energetic levels of their shoulders, their crown chakra. They're being compressed, crushed by all of these different layers of energetic responsibility. It's really, really wounding to the solar plexus because keeping in mind, if we feel that we need to be responsible for other people's well-being and we feel we have to fix all of these things, it deeply wounds the solar plexus. And that's also where we hold our worth and value. So start to really tease out for yourself, is my worth and value linked to these behaviors? Because you can be sure that you're leaking energy at some point within your energy body. Now, generally speaking, as we go on a journey to heal the rescuer wound, we really need to focus on strengthening our energetic field, on strengthening our boundaries. And this means tending to ourselves before supporting others. It's almost like you see this analogy on the airplane when the masks drop down. Do you take the oxygen mask for yourself before helping others? Because you're going to be no good to someone if you're lying asphyxiated on the ground, And we can't pour from an empty cup. And I always say this, there's a lovely analogy that I've spoken into in many of the pods. Imagine a dripping tap. And if you're the cup underneath that tap, and every little drip is a beautiful little source of energy, if you are a cup in which every drop that comes into that cup, you immediately take the cup away and pour that into someone else's cup, your cup is going to be empty. It is going to be empty. There's nothing to pour from if you're giving all of that energetic, beautiful droplets of goodness away to other people. So what I suggest is put a little saucer under your cup. Take some time without giving those drops away to allow your cup to fill to the brim and then allow it to overflow. Because if your cup is overflowing, you can collect all of the excess in that lovely little saucer. Use that to fuel other people's cup so that you are never, ever depleting from your own primary cup, your own energy source. You know, you cannot pour from an empty cup. It is so important to really be mindful of your own energetic boundaries, your own energetic source before you ever step into the rescuer role. So that's the main thing to take into account on this journey. And that can be really, really, really hard for people. I'm not going to lie. It has been a chronic journey for me. And it can be really challenging to heal from this, okay? So be gentle with yourself. Now, the third and final role I want to speak into is the persecutor. And this is a tricky one because we don't ever like to think of ourselves as being the persecutor. But again, we do fulfill this role in many other people's lives. And you know, this one is a really interesting one, okay? Because before I even get into talking about this, I will never forget I was doing The Artist's Way, which is such a beautiful book. If you have not read The Artist's Way or journeyed through it, I highly recommend it. It essentially is a journey of evolution in which we get back in touch with our intuition and our creative energy. And it's done over a series of about 12 weeks where you get tasks every week and you do journaling prompts every week. And, you know, you just start to dream a new way of being into the world. It's really, really beautiful. It's actually the portal through which I received all the downloads and the information for my Oracle deck was when I was doing The Artist's Way. It just seems to have a beautiful energetic way about creating space for divine downloads and just divine creation to move through you. And early on in that book, it was chapter 2, I will never forget it. The author talks about identifying who the crazy makers are in your life. And you know, it's so easy to sit down and start listing off all the crazy makers. Who creates mayhem in your world around you? And who criticizes, who attacks, who controls, who blames, all of these things. It's so easy to sit and write that list. And essentially what the author was trying to highlight was, you know, recognizing that there are crazy makers in your world and how you relate to them is so important. But one huge realization I had was, are you a crazy maker in your own life? Are you a crazy maker in your own world? Do you control your behaviors? Do you blame yourself? Do you criticize yourself? Do you attack yourself as a form of self-protection? And how do those behaviors get projected or show up in your relational dynamics where you become a crazy maker in other people's worlds? Because I have to tell you, we fulfill each one of these roles. So get really honest with yourself. You're not skipping through life getting away from any of these behaviors. So this is the behavioral presentation of the persecutor. It is the controlling one. It is the person who blames. It is the person who criticizes and attacks as a form of self-protection. So I really want to highlight, because some crazy makers or persecutors in our world, they are very loud and aggressive about how they go about doing this. But I want to highlight the more subtle, quieter forms of this role. It's the person that's cool. Do you know those people who have the cool energy? They withhold, they are avoidant, or they're passive aggressive. they are also the persecutor. So keeping in mind, it doesn't have to be the loud and aggressive crazy maker in your world, and you don't have to fulfill that role either. But are you any of the other more passive aggressive forms of this persecutor? And they are more subtle, and they are deeply ingrained patterns of behavior. And they often, from a trauma informed perspective, come around from parental dynamics or caregivers who were punitive in a lot of ways. Or if we were in environments in our early years where we, felt very unsafe to be vulnerable. And this can arise when, there may have been a primary caregiver who was emotionally volatile, or, it wasn't acceptable for us to actually express our emotions in a very, very safe way. We keep all of these things inside us and then we kind of lash out. And the persecutor often learns quite early on that it's safer to actually attack first. So it's fascinating what I see in my sessions when I'm doing energetic work with people. Sometimes I see a scorpion energy in the energy body, like the sting in the tail. And, it's so interesting when I work with animal archetypes through my shamanic work, because the scorpion is a protector. And, the scorpion is a lovely energetic archetype or power animal to work with in some senses. But also there's a sting in the tail. And it's the same with the serpent. I love working with the serpent, a representation of the divine feminine, and, a representation of shedding old skins, of being grounded, keeping your belly close to the earth. I love all these archetypes. But the serpent also comes with a serpent's tongue, a forked tongue. So keeping in mind that, these are the kind of energetics I tend to see in the energy body of someone that kind of has this kind of persecutor energy. It's this attacking first. Sometimes we also, because we feel very unsafe or we felt unsafe growing up, we try to control the environment around us, So that's really, really important to note. Do you step into a kind of more controlling way of being? And keeping in mind, oftentimes this is done out of a sense of kind of just yearning for safety and predictability, I think in those circumstances, it is easier to control and plan interactions because we feel safer in that. Because if we get caught off guard in some ways, we feel vulnerable and we don't like that feeling as persecutors. Now, from an energetic or shamanic perspective, usually what I tend to see and what I explore with some of my clients is that, we actually just have pain internally as the persecutor. And instead of actually sitting with that pain, acknowledging that pain, being vulnerable within the pain, we just project it outwards, And frequently it's a defense that I often tend to see in someone who has unprocessed victimhood themselves. So you can see that this energetic dance between the victim and the persecutor tends to go hand in hand. And oftentimes the victim can step into the persecutor role without even recognizing. And the sooner that we can learn to go on this journey of recognizing when we victimize ourselves and process the emotion of that. Where did that energy come from? We actually stop being the persecutor as much. So most persecutors were actually once the victim, and we positioned ourselves as the victims, and that role often allows us to form a lovely defensive armour that keeps people out, but unfortunately, it also comes with this kind of defensive element. So it's almost like you're going into every space, into every relational dynamic with your armour on and your sword ready for attack, ready to behead someone or cut the knees from under someone if needs be. Now, from a healing perspective, it's very important, again, to really focus on our earlier environment, our earlier childhood dynamics, and what we kind of learned in relation to our caregivers, but also to get really interested in where this persecutor behavior actually came from, because this is often transmitted through lineages. So it's really interesting, and I tend to do a lot of ancestral clearing, ancestral work with these type of behaviors. When you kind of recognize, oh my God, my mother was like that, my father was like that, my grandmother was like that, my grandfather was like that. One of my primary caregivers actually had this behavioral pattern. So we often tend to inherit these dynamics and behaviors. So again, take a really nitty gritty look at your relational dynamics with people is so important. Now, after going through each of these roles, hopefully you're starting to recognize, do I show up predominantly in one of these positions or potentially all of these positions? Because yes, there is a fluidity between these roles. People often move between the three positions depending on the relationship that they're in. And sometimes we even fluctuate between these different roles within a single conversation with somebody. Have you ever sat down and actually recognized your nervous system activates at certain times in the relationship? You project, you get defensive at certain times in the relationship, you step into the victimhood, or potentially you're stepping into the savior, the rescuer space. And that can all be within a half an hour cup of coffee catch up with somebody. So it's really, really important to recognize that actually Cartman's original model did suggest this kind of fluidity, and fluidity is an important part with all of this. However, most people actually have a familiar or more home role that they tend to default to. So keeping in mind, we automatically default to one of these roles as our most comfortable space. But really, really reflect on the fact that we do visit all three roles. And that's just part of being human, So just as a little example of how we may visit each of these roles. So let's look at the day-to-day in a workplace setting. So you may be the persecutor if you are someone's boss and people report into you, they will persecute you. You step into the persecutor role. However, with your own boss that you kind of you put into the persecutor role, you become the victim in relation to them. And, sometimes actually with our co-workers, you can step into the rescuer mode because you'll have a co-worker that potentially is struggling. So on a single day, within a single week, you are the persecutor, you are the victim, and you are the rescuer. And, these roles are relational, they're situational, and it's really important to recognize that they're not really fixed identity traits, but they are patterns of behavior. And the sooner that we kind of can become aware of when we're positioning ourselves in certain spaces or we're positioning other people, we begin to then evolve because the awareness is there, and I really just want to highlight again that these aren't fixed identity traits. They're learned behavioral patterns to keep us safe at the end of the day. So I just want to name here that the triangle is a closed system, and it often runs if at least two people agree, even on an unconscious level, that they are ready to play the game. They are ready to step into the role that keeps each of us trapped in that relational dynamic. And that leads me into looking at the karmic and energetic relational dynamics of these roles. I tend to find doing this energetic work, which I just love it. I love it because when we call in the energy of a person or a family member or even an environment or a house, all of these different things energetically that we are in relationship with every day, when we call that energy in sessions, I love to look at the relational dynamic that comes to the surface for people. However, a lot of these relational dynamics tend to be karmic. These are repeated relational patterns or loops, karmic loops, in which this same dynamic resurfaces across different relationships, across different generations. And, until we consciously see that this is a repeating pattern within our relational dynamics or within our familial lineage, the loop will just continue to play out. An example of this may include someone that ends up in relationships in which they're consistently the rescuer, regardless of who they are in relationship with. Are you the rescuer in every single relationship? Are you predominantly the victim in every single relationship? Or do you end up as the persecutor in most of your relationships? If that is the case, if you look back through some of your relational dynamics, a lot of people I tend to work with, we look at the kind of romantic relational dynamics or familial dynamics in which this exact pattern is playing out. If there is a pattern there, I tend to find that it's not relationship specific. It's a loop. It's a karmic cycle that you are here to work through and clear and break in this lifetime. And if this is the case, we tend to kind of position ourselves in specific roles in relationship to other people. And then we form these energetic dances with people that then tend to lock us into that position, locking us into kind of fixed roles within specific relationships, because it's actually the relational or the karmic imprint is within us at that stage, And this energetic relationship tends to show up sometimes like, you get a sense that it's sticky, you get a sense that it's not right, but you're absolutely like trapped in that space. You're unable to act differently. You're unable to kind of show up differently with specific people in your life, even though you know that there are better ways of relationally interacting with these people, The pull of the energy is too great. The karmic loop that you're trapped in is just too great. I just want to highlight that this is energetic. This isn't a flaw in your character in any way. This is just an energetic pull that you have learned or inherited, which just is so strong. And the way that we heal this is by acknowledging the karmic loop and actually clearing your energy field of these karmic imprints. That's what shifts the dynamic. And, when we do this work internally ourselves, our relational dynamics will automatically shift around us. You don't need to be, preaching to the other people in these relational dynamics, because just when you stop showing up in a specific way, they'll be forced into a different way of being, because just being in relationship with you, if you don't show up in the same role every single time and you just decide to choose to show up differently, it will automatically shift the energy between the two of you. And keeping in mind this kind of karmic patterning, sometimes it can be so deep, especially within familial units, that you couldn't dream of showing up any differently within a relationship, because it would be too painful to interact with the other person in this dynamic, because you think maybe they'll get too upset, maybe they'll be volatile, and it just feels so huge, But keeping in mind, that other person will continue to show up in that role until we make a change to how we relate to that person. You're actually doing them a favor, because you're helping them to heal karmically by doing your own inner work. Because when you recognize, God, I'm not showing up like that anymore, I'm actually just not engaging like this anymore, I've had enough, you begin the deeper healing work yourself. It pulls you out of the familiar role. Where else is there to go? You're not going to fulfill that dynamic. You're not going to fulfill that rescuer, that victim, that persecutor role with this individual anymore. And it will literally, naturally augment the relational dynamic, and your energetic stance shift will allow the relationship to evolve. Some relationships will ultimately fall away because people don't like that we change internally and no longer want to get pulled into these karmic or relational dynamics with people. But the ones that are meant to be, the people that are supposed to evolve with you, they will go on the journey where they recognize, oh my God, we have a much more healthy relational dynamic due to these energetic shifts. Now, generally speaking, I just want to speak a little bit into actually healing these wounds in a safe way, because the energy augments how our nervous system functions, and the nervous system has a register in which we will try to look for safety. That's why some of our relational dynamics, or these patterns, or these roles we step into, they're comfortable, even though they're painful, because they feel safe to us. That's what we have been conditioned to believe, that we're safer in that role than in an unsafe environment in which we can't predict the outcome. So safety has to be the main goal when we're doing this deeper emotional and energetic work. And to be honest with you, if we do not have safety, if we do not cultivate safety for ourselves, change is very, very hard to elicit. So, when we try to process deeper traumas or the energetic imprints or wounds that kind of led to these behaviors in the first place, we have to do it from a perspective of safety, because if we're trying to do this in a state of threat, it just reinforces the actual threat response. So it's so important to try and find safety within the nervous system as you explore this. So, doing this type of work with people that make you feel safe, in a safe environment, with safe people, that is going to be the key. Now, I also want to speak into the pace at which we try to attempt to heal these wounds, because that's really important as well. Because if we try to step out of a role really, really quickly, that's really, really deeply ingrained within us, that can feel completely shocking to the system. It can bring around a lot of energetic dysregulation within the nervous system. And sometimes it can re-traumatize us to the original wound in the first place. So what I tend to say is, do small incremental exposures. Don't flood your nervous system. Don't flood your energy system with huge, big shifts or changes when we begin to have these realizations. Can you do it in baby steps? Can you have conversations that make you feel vulnerable with people who feel safe first? And there's this concept of the pendulum, which I really love when it comes to nervous system behavior. So if you imagine a pendulum that's swinging from side to side, and the edges are discomfort with safety in the very center, can you allow yourself to move towards the edge of discomfort before swinging back into the center, into a sense of safety? And then again, allowing yourself to swing out towards the edge of discomfort again, rather than going to the edge and throwing yourself off the edge. Because sometimes leaping deep into this really painful work can just be so hard on the nervous system, hard on the heart, hard on the energy body, So like I say, trying to do these things with safe people in a way in which we just broach the edge in a gentle way. We push ourselves a little bit into discomfort. We try and feel into what it feels like to be vulnerable with some safe people, having safe conversations with people who will hear you and acknowledge you're trying to explore the different roles that you place yourself in, that you feel placed in. That is the key to healing in a safe way, in a way in which our nervous system can become regulated, and in a way in which we can actually hold the changes that evolve. Okay? So this is really, really important, because sometimes if we try to actually do healing work with a nervous system that actually is very, very unsafe, we tend to end up stepping into a space in which we spiritually bypass things, because we can't sit in to the discomfort of the shadow element of it. So everything becomes light and lofty. We don't want to sit in the discomfort. We don't want to kind of allow ourselves to swing into the areas of discomfort which actually allow us to heal. The edges that's where we heal. That's where we expand. That's where we grow, you know. So allow yourself to kind of ground and resource yourself first before you proceed towards the edge. And this feeds back into that concept of filling up your cup first, not pouring from an empty cup, making sure your boundaries are good. Your boundaries with yourself are good. Speaking of which, I previously recorded many moons ago a podcast around boundaries, and that looks at our boundaries with other people, but also our boundaries with ourselves, which are usually very leaky in these circumstances. So go check out that pod if this is speaking to you, and explore how to heal your relationship to yourself and others. That will ultimately allow you to have a safer, more grounded nervous system to do this expansive work of kind of assuming new ways of being in relationship with each other. So just to wrap up with things, we have explored these three relational dynamics today. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about yourself and others. And I would really, really love for you to kind of recognize what your habitual role is. What is your home role, your comfortable role, and become aware of it in your relational dynamics. And, you know, it's really, really important that when we become aware of that, we become to get curious about it. Just start to get really curious about it. Where did you start kind of learning to show up in that way, you know? And when you become aware of it, it's very hard to ignore that relational dynamic anymore with different people. So just awareness begins to kind of shift the energetics of the position you hold in the triangle, which will then kind of encourage others to kind of challenge their relational dynamic to you, you know? So, you know, it's very interesting because you can't actually be the persecutor opposite someone who won't step in or play the victim role. So can you see, you know, if you step out of the victim role, there's no longer a persecutor to meet the victim. And that's really, really important, you know? So have a little sit and a think about it. I would love for you to kind of think over the next week what role you default to and who you default to the role with. And, you know, that sitting and kind of acknowledging that brings awareness and it interrupts the pattern. So that is the pod for this week, my love. And I just love that you guys are engaging. I love the feedback that I'm getting from you guys about how this is helping you to evolve on an energetic level. It's changing your relationship dynamics and also bringing more safety into your energy body. And that is the key. And the aim with a lot of this stuff is to help you evolve and, you know, feel safe in who you are becoming. And obviously, we want for you to be able to kind of step into a space in which you can express your authentic self in a really, really safe way. And, you know, first of all, we have to figure out who that authentic self is by stripping back the conditioning, stripping back the conditioned mind, and that controls us unconsciously or subconsciously. And hopefully this week you'll have gotten a flavor for how to move beyond some of these relational dynamics. So with love from my heart to yours, my loves, have a beautiful, beautiful week.